time,
The fleet is
40
taking heavy
vessels
fire.
tumbled
We must
into the
hold the
cold
line.
void.
Their shields are
They did
down.
not
Divert
fly.
power to the forward
They
batteries.
bled. Their hulls
Power
were
levels
scarred
dropping.
with deep
Shields
plasma
failing.
burns.
Rerouting
Whole
auxiliary
sections
power
of
now.
armor were
Brace
sheared
for
away,
impact.
exposing the darkened, lifeless decks beneath. They drifted like a graveyard of metal caught in the silent pull of a foreign sun. Inside those dying ships were 40,000 souls, the last of the Velinar. They had nowhere left to run. Commander Valia stood on the shattered bridge of her flagship. The air in the compartment was thick with the smell of ozone, burning wire, and despair. Emergency lighting cast long, bloody shadows across the faces of her crew. There should have been 20 officers manning the bridge stations. There were only 6. The rest had perished during the long, terrifying flight across the galaxy. Some died from hull breaches, some from starvation, some simply laid down in the dark and let the cold take them. Valia gripped the edge of the navigation console. Her hands trembled. Her knuckles were pale against her dark-textured skin. She looked at the main view screen. Hanging in the endless black, vast and impossibly serene, was a blue and green marble. Earth, she had heard the rumors, a young species, brash, fractured. They had barely mastered faster than light travel. In the grand hierarchy of the galaxy, humanity was an infant taking its first unsteady steps into the dark. But the Corax Empire had burned everything else. The Corax had glassed Valia's homeworld. They had hunted her refugee fleet through 3 star systems, picking them off one by one. The wolves were always just one jump behind. Her communications officer, a young man who looked too thin and too tired for his uniform, turned to her. His voice was a dry rasp. "Commander, life support is failing across the fleet. The lower decks are freezing. We have 48 hours of breathable air left. Less for the children." Valia closed her eyes. 48 hours. 3 generations of running only to suffocate in the shadow of a stranger's world. "Open a channel," she said. Broad spectrum. She straightened her uniform. She brushed the ash from her collar. She prepared to beg. Deep beneath the granite shell of Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, the United States Space Command was a fortress of quiet discipline. The air was cool and smelled of circulating ozone and old coffee. Rows of technicians sat before glowing consoles, monitoring the silent expanse of the solar system. Admiral Sterling Vance stood at the center of the command floor. He was 62 years old. His hair was iron gray, cut close to the scalp. His face was weathered, mapped with the deep lines of a man who had spent a lifetime carrying the weight of impossible decisions. He wore his 4 stars without arrogance, but with the quiet, heavy gravity of duty. "Sir," a radar operator called out. The young lieutenant's voice cracked. "Anomalous energy surge at lunar orbit. Massive displacement." Vance stepped toward the primary tactical screen. "Put it up." The main display shifted. 40 contacts appeared. They were not in formation. They were tumbling, drifting, venting atmosphere into the void. Red warning runes cascaded down the side of the screen. "Identify," Vance ordered. His voice was a low, steady rumble. It anchored the room. "Unknown configuration," the lieutenant replied, fingers flying across his keyboard. "Massive thermal scarring. No active weapon locks. Admiral, they are bleeding power. They are dead in the water." A communications officer pressed a hand to her headset. "Sir, we are receiving a transmission, audio and visual. It is unencrypted. Put it on the main screen." The image of space vanished, replaced by the face of Commander Valia. She looked exhausted. She looked broken. But she stood tall. "People of Earth," Valia said. Her voice was translated through the mainframe, carrying a mechanical echo. But the desperation in her eyes needed no translation. "I am Commander Valiasu of the Velinar. We are the last of our kind. We are not an invasion force. We are refugees. We have fled the Corax Empire. They burned our world. They hunted us across the stars. We have nothing left. We have no fuel. We have no food. Our children are dying. We ask for shelter." She paused, her throat swallowed hard. "We ask for mercy." The command center fell dead silent. Every eye turned to Admiral Vance. In the political theaters of Washington, a request like this would take weeks to debate. Committees would form. Risk assessments would be drafted. Politicians would argue about the cost, about the danger of bringing an alien war to their doorstep. Vance did not have weeks. He looked at the telemetry. 48 hours of air. "Get me the president," Vance said. 2 minutes later, the secure line to the Oval Office was active. Vance laid out the tactical situation in 3 sentences. The president listened. The silence on the line stretched for a heavy, agonizing moment. "They are bringing a war to our doorstep," Sterling, the president, said. "Yes, ma'am," Vance replied. "What is your recommendation?" Vance looked at the frozen image of the alien commander on his screen. He saw the hollow cheeks. He saw the pride stripped away by raw survival. He thought about what it meant to wear the uniform. He thought about what it meant to be human. "If we let 40,000 people choke to death on our front porch because we are afraid," Vance said, "then we are not a people worth saving." The president exhaled. "Do it, Admiral, but God help us when the wolves show up." Vance cut the line. He turned to the command floor. The room was waiting. The men and women of Space Command watched him, ready to move heaven and earth on his word. "Open a direct channel to the alien flagship," Vance commanded. The screen flickered. Valia's face reappeared. She looked bracingly at the camera, expecting rejection, expecting the cold shoulder of a universe that had shown her nothing but cruelty. "Commander Valia," Vance said. His voice was steady, resonant, carrying the absolute authority of the United States Navy. "This is Admiral Sterling Vance of the United States Space Command. Stand down your remaining thrusters. We are sending heavy tugs to stabilize your fleet." Valia blinked. The shock on her face was absolute. You are taking us in." "You asked for shelter, Commander. You have it. We are routing your fleet to Kepler Station. It is a deep space orbital habitat. It will be your new home." Valia's composure finally broke. A single tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. "Admiral," she whispered, "we have no money. We have nothing to offer you. Why are you doing this?" Vance looked at her. "Because you asked." He severed the connection. The time for talking was over. Now the impossible work began. "Initiate protocol, Vance barked, the command center erupting into motion around him. "I want the Army Corps of Engineers mobilized. I want every heavy lifter, every cargo hauler, and every medical ship docked at Canaveral and Vandenberg Airborne in 2 hours. They have 48 hours of air. We will get there in 24. Move." 250 miles above the Earth, Kepler Station was a monument to human ambition. It was a massive orbital ring, a skeleton of titanium and carbon fiber spanning miles across the dark. It had been built to house 50,000 colonists for the Mars expansion, but budget cuts had left it empty. A ghost town in the sky. Now it was about to become the busiest construction site in human history. Thaddeus Boone floated in zero gravity, a welding torch in his heavy, calloused hand. Boone was a senior engineer for the orbital construction yards. He was a man built like a cinder block, 50 years old, with a thick beard and a temper that matched the searing heat of his plasma torch. He stared down the length of the central corridor. It was empty. It was cold. And he had exactly 3 weeks to turn this hollow shell into a functioning alien paradise. The logistics were a nightmare. The Velinar did not breathe the same nitrogen-oxygen mix as humans. They needed higher humidity. They required a specific spectrum of ultraviolet light to synthesize vitamins. The gravity plating had to be recalibrated to 0.8 Gs so their brittle bones would not snap under Earth standard pressure. Chief Boone, his radio crackled. It was a young engineer sounding panicked. "The life support retrofits. We do not have the scrubbers. The requisition forms are stuck in orbital logistics." Boone keyed his mic. "Son, listen to me very carefully. I do not care about requisition forms. I do not care about the bureaucrats down on the dirt. There are 40,000 starving people sitting in dead ships 300 miles from here. You go down to the primary storage bay. You take a plasma cutter, and you rip the scrubbers out of the decommissioned transport hulls. Do you understand me yet, Chief?" "We are not building a hotel," Boone growled, kicking off the bulkhead and flying down the corridor. "We are building a lifeboat. Make it work." For 3 weeks, the space around Kepler Station was a chaotic, beautiful ballet of human industry. Hundreds of ships swarmed the ring. Thousands of roughnecks, welders, electricians, and technicians worked 24-hour shifts. When one crew collapsed from exhaustion, another took their place. They drank terrible coffee from sealed pouches. They slept in zero-G harnesses in the corridors. They bled from pinched fingers and bruised ribs. Boone did not sleep for the first 4 days. He was everywhere. He was in the ventilation shafts rerouting water lines. He was on the outer hull securing the massive solar arrays. He pushed his crews to the breaking point, and then he pushed them further. On the 8th day, Commander Valia was allowed onto the station to inspect the progress. She was escorted by heavily armed Marines at a precaution Vance insisted upon, but her eyes were not on the weapons. Her eyes were on the station. She walked through the agricultural sector. What had been a sterile metal cavern a week ago was now filled with thousands of tons of soil shipped up from Earth. Human botanists were planting fast-growing flora, carefully mixing earth seeds with the few surviving Velinar plant samples Valia's people had preserved. The air was warm. It smelled of dirt and rain and life. She found Thaddeus Boone sitting on a crate, his face covered in grease, drinking a pouch of black coffee. He looked up at her, wiping his mouth with the back of a dirty glove. Commander Boone said, giving a tired nod, "Hope the lighting isn't too harsh. We swapped out the main arrays for ultraviolet emitters. Should keep your people's skin from cracking." Valia stared at him. "You did this." "In 8 days," Boone snorted. "Me and about 5,000 of the stubbornest sons of bitches ever born, yeah." "It is a miracle." "It ain't a miracle," Lady Boone said, standing up. His joints popped. "It's elbow grease. It's what we do." He handed her a spare pouch of coffee. "Try it. Tastes like battery acid, but it keeps the engine running." Valia took the pouch. She squeezed a few drops of the hot, bitter liquid into her mouth. Her eyes widened. It was awful. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the drink, for everything." Boone waved a dismissive hand, turning back to his control panel. "Don't thank me yet. We ain't done. And the clock is ticking." The clock was always ticking. By the end of the 3rd week, the transfer was complete. 40,000 Velinar citizens were evacuated from their dying fleet and moved into Kepler Station. For the first time in a generation, they slept in beds that did not vibrate with failing engine harmonics. They breathed clean, warm air. They ate real food. But survival is never simple, and the universe is rarely kind. The first child collapsed on a Tuesday. He was a young boy, barely 7 years old by Earth standards. He was playing in one of the newly constructed gardens when his skin turned a violent shade of ash gray. He fell to the deck, convulsing, coughing up a black, viscous fluid. Within an hour, 20 more children fell. By nightfall, there were 300. The Velinar medical bay descended into sheer panic. Dr. Thalos, the chief medical officer for the refugees, was a brilliant man, but he was old and he was exhausted. He stood over a diagnostic bed, his hands shaking violently as he looked at the bioscanners. His people were dying. Again. Admiral Vance did not hesitate. The moment the medical alert sounded, he bypassed civilian channels and contacted the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. He demanded their best. They gave him Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne was a quiet, intense man in his late 40s. He had spent his life hunting hemorrhagic fevers in the darkest, most dangerous corners of Earth. He arrived on Kepler Station via a high-speed military shuttle, flanked by a team of virologists carrying black cases of experimental equipment. Thorne walked into the Velinar medical bay. It was a scene from hell. Children were crying. The air was thick with the smell of sickness. Dr. Thalos looked up, his eyes wide with despair. "We cannot stop it," the alien doctor whispered. "It is a pathogen, something from the long voyage. The medicine we need, we do not have the synthesis equipment. The compounds break down in your atmosphere. They are dying." Thorne did not offer words of comfort. He stripped off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and walked to the nearest biobed. He looked at the failing alien child. He looked at the monitors. Dr. Thalos Thorne said, his voice cold, analytical, and completely devoid of panic. "Panic killed patients. I need complete genetic sequencing on this child. I need your baseline physiological markers, and I need the chemical breakdown of the medicine you say is failing." Thalos stared at him. "Our biology is alien to you. You cannot understand the cascade failure happening in their organs." Thorne turned to him. Eyes hard as flint. "Biology is biology, doctor. It is a machine that is breaking. Now give me the data." For the next 60 hours, Eris Thorne went to war. He did not leave the laboratory. He did not sleep. He drank Thaddeus Boone's terrible coffee and stared at holographic projections of alien DNA until his eyes bled. He analyzed the failure points. He ran thousands of simulated chemical compounds through the station's mainframe. The situation grew worse. The death toll climbed. 5 children, then 10. Commander Velia stood outside the glass of the medical bay watching Thorne work. She watched the human doctor scream in frustration, throwing a data pad against the bulkhead when a simulation failed. She saw the dark rings under his eyes. She saw the absolute uncompromising refusal to accept defeat. On the 60th hour, Thorne stopped. He stood frozen in front of a monitor. The simulated protein chain locked into place. It held. He turned around. His face was pale. His hands were shaking from caffeine and exhaustion. "It is not a pathogen," Thorne croaked. His voice was completely shot. He looked at Thalos. "You've been treating them for a virus. It's not a virus. It's genetic degradation, severe trauma stress. 3 generations of living in deep space, breathing recycled air, living in constant terror. Their DNA is unraveling. The sudden change in environment on this station triggered the collapse." Thalos looked stunned. Then, "There is no cure. You cannot cure trauma." "No," Thorne said, grabbing a sterile vial and walking toward a centrifuge. "You can't cure trauma, but you can stabilize the telomeres. We don't need your alien medicine. We need ours." Thorne synthesized the compound himself. It was a cocktail of heavy human immunosuppressants, tailored retrovirals, and raw adrenaline modified heavily to bond with the Velinar blood cells. It was dangerous. It was untested. He walked to the first bed. The boy was barely breathing. His heart rate was a weak, erratic flutter on the monitor. Thorne injected the serum directly into the child's intravenous line. The room held its breath. Velia pressed her hands against the glass. Thalos gripped the edge of the bed. Thorne just watched the monitor. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. 20 seconds. The boy's breathing stopped. The monitor flatlined. A long, continuous drone filled the room. No, Velia sobbed from outside the glass. Thorne did not back away. He did not accept it. He grabbed a medical light, checked the boy's pupils. "Come on," Thorne whispered. "Come on, you tough little bastard. Fight." The monitor beeped. Once. A strong, violent spike. Then again. The boy gasped. His chest arched off the bed as his lungs pulled in a massive draft of air. The ash-gray color of his skin began to recede, replaced by a deep, healthy blue. His eyes fluttered open. He looked at Thorne. Thorne fell back into a chair, wiping a hand across his face. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "Mass produce it," Thorne ordered his team, not looking away from the boy. "Get it into every child on this deck. Now." Within 12 hours, the crisis broke. The children stabilized. The dying stopped. Commander Velia found Dr. Thorne in the station's cafeteria later that night. He was asleep at a table, his head resting on his crossed arms, a half-empty pouch of coffee near his elbow. She did not wake him. She took off her own ceremonial cloak, the mantle of her command, the highest honor of her people, and gently draped it over the shoulders of the human doctor. She walked over to the viewport and looked out at the stars. For the first time in her life, she did not look at the dark void with terror. She looked at the human warships patrolling the perimeter of Kepler Station. Sleek, armed, deadly. They had built her a home. They had saved her children. But out there in the deep black, the wolves were still hunting, and the Corax did not forgive prey that escaped. Deep in the Cheyenne Mountain complex, the warning klaxons began to wail. Admiral Sterling Vance was drinking a cup of coffee when the red lights washed over the command center. He did not flinch. He set the mug down, perfectly centered on his desk. He stood up, adjusting the collar of his uniform, feeling the familiar cold weight of impending violence settle into his stomach. Sitrep Vance barked, striding onto the command floor. The radar operator was pale. "Sir, massive hyperspace distortion detected. It's not a refugee fleet this time. The energy signatures are astronomical." Where Vance asked, "Just beyond the orbit of Mars." "Sir, they bypassed the outer warning buoys. They jumped right into our backyard. Put it on screen." The main display changed. It was not 40 battered ships. It was a wall of black metal, massive angular dreadnoughts bristling with heavy plasma cannons and thick ablative armor. They moved with the terrifying synchronized precision of an apex predator. A transmission forced its way through the human encryption firewalls. It bypassed every security protocol the military had. The screen split. On the display was the face of General Valdrax. He was a Corax. His skin was scaled in dark crimson. His eyes were completely black, devoid of pupils, radiating a cold, ancient malice. He sat on a command throne that looked like it had been carved from bone. People of Earth, Valdrax hissed. The translation software struggled with the guttural clicks of his language, making his voice sound like grinding metal. I am General Valdrax of the Corax Empire. You are harboring stolen property. The Velinar belong to the Empire. They are our slaves. You have 1 hour to disable your orbital defenses and hand them over to my vanguard. Valdrax leaned forward, his black eyes staring through the screen, promising absolute annihilation. If you refuse, I will burn your station. I will burn your fleet. And then I will burn your world. In the command center, fear gripped the room. The technicians looked at the sheer size of the enemy fleet. They were outgunned. They were outmatched. The logical choice, the safe choice, was compliance. Admiral Vance looked at the alien warlord. He did not feel fear, he felt anger. A cold, quiet, profoundly American anger. Vance stepped up to the primary communication console. He keyed the mic. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke with the quiet, dangerous calm of a man who held the keys to the arsenal of democracy. General Valdrax Vance said, "This is Admiral Sterling Vance. The people on that station are under the protection of the United States of America and by extension, the planet Earth. They are free. They are not property." Vance leaned over the console. "We do not negotiate with slavers. We do not surrender to bullies. If you cross the orbit of Mars, we will consider it an act of war and we will put you down. This is your only warning." Valdrax laughed. It was a harsh barking sound. "You primitive fools! You think your metal toys can stop the Empire? We will teach you the cost of defiance." The transmission cut. Vance turned to his officers. The time for building was over. The time for healing was over. Sound General Quarters, Vance ordered. "Bring the fleet to condition red. Weapons free. Spin up the orbital railguns." The men and women of Space Command went to work. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, hard resolve. Up in orbit, Kepler Station flashed with emergency lights. Civilian personnel were locked down. Thaddeus Boone dropped his welding torch and picked up a heavy kinetic shotgun. Dr. Eris Thorne locked the medical bay doors and prepared the trauma beds. Commander Valia stood with her people watching the human warships break formation and accelerate toward the darkness. They were going to fight. These strangers, these humans, were going to fly into the teeth of an unstoppable empire to protect people they had just met. Admiral Vance watched the tactical map update in real time. The Corax fleet was advancing. The human fleet was moving to intercept. "May God have mercy on them," Vance whispered to the empty room. "Because we will not. The void between worlds is a silent battlefield. There is no roar of engines. There is no thunder of artillery. There is only the cold mechanical reality of mathematics, distance, and velocity." General Valdrax did not respect mathematics. He respected terror. His vanguard fleet of 20 heavy cruisers accelerated toward Kepler Station in a wide, sweeping crescent. They were painted in the crimson and black of the Corax Empire. Their hulls bristled with thermal lances and heavy plasma batteries. For 1,000 years, the Corax had used this exact formation to break the spirits of 100 different species. They relied on the visual intimidation of their glowing energy shields, a shimmering wall of hard light that rendered them practically invincible to the energy weapons of the wider galaxy. Valdrax sat on his command throne watching the tactical display. He saw the human ships holding their position around the orbital habitat. They were small, they were gray, they lacked the elegant, sweeping lines of advanced alien architecture. They looked like crude iron bricks floating in the dark. "Fire the primary batteries," Valdrax sneered. "Burn the defenders. Leave the station intact for the boarding crews." On the bow of the Corax cruisers, massive plasma coils ignited. They burned with the fury of captured stars. In the vacuum of space, 20 blinding spears of superheated plasma lashed out across the dark, aimed directly at the heart of the United States Space Command's defensive line. On the bridge of the USS Liberty, a destroyer positioned on the Vanguard's left flank, Captain Miller did not flinch. He was a veteran of the orbital guard. He chewed on the end of an unlit cigar, his eyes locked on the telemetry screens. "Incoming thermal spikes," his tactical officer called out. "Time to impact, 12 seconds. Miller leaned forward. "Drop gravity anchors. Pivot port 30 degrees, fire lateral thrusters. The USS Liberty did not try to absorb the blow. It did not raise a magical energy shield. It relied on the brutal effective physics of human engineering. The destroyer's thrusters fired in a perfectly synchronized burst. The massive gray ship twisted on its axis, dropping vertically in the vacuum just as the Corax plasma spear tore through the empty space where the Liberty had been a fraction of a second before. The superheated energy vanished into the void, hitting nothing. Valdrax blinked, his tactical display updated. The human ships had not been destroyed. They had scattered, moving with a jarring mechanical agility that defied the Corax understanding of inertial mass. Before Valdrax could order a second volley, Admiral Sterling Vance gave his counter order from the command center in Cheyenne Mountain. All ships, weapons free. Show them what we are made of. Captain Miller spat the unlit cigar into his hand. Target the lead cruiser. Spin up the magnetic coils. Deep inside the bowels of the USS Liberty, the ship's primary weapon system awakened. It was not a laser. It was not a beam of concentrated light. It was a railgun. Two massive electromagnetic rails running the entire length of the ship's spine began to hum. The power draw was so immense that the lighting on the bridge flickered and dimmed. In the loading chamber, an autoloader slammed a solid 80-pound slug of depleted tungsten into the breech. There was no explosive warhead. There was no fuse. It was simply a very heavy rock waiting to be thrown. Fire, Miller said. The recoil shook the entire destroyer. In the vacuum of space, there was no muzzle flash, only a microscopic distortion of light. The tungsten slug left the barrel of the railgun at Mach 25. It crossed the distance between the human defensive line and the Corax vanguard in less than 3 seconds. General Valdrax watched the incoming projectile on his screen. His defensive officers did not panic. The Corax energy shields were designed to absorb, dissipate, and deflect high-yield plasma and focused radiation. They were the absolute pinnacle of energy displacement technology, but they had never been hit by 80 pounds of solid metal, moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The tungsten slug struck the center of Valdrax's energy shield. The hard light barrier flared a blinding, agonizing purple as its computer core tried to calculate the thermal displacement of an object that possessed no thermal energy, only pure apocalyptic kinetic force. The shield did not dissipate the kinetic energy. It shattered. The barrier broke like glass under a sledgehammer. The tungsten slug did not even slow down. It punched through the heavily armored bow of the Corax. Heavy cruiser traveled the entire length of the ship's interior, tore through the central reactor core, and exited out the rear engine block. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Then the Corax cruiser ceased to exist. The reactor breach triggered a cascading failure. The massive ship detonated from the inside out, expanding into a silent blossoming sphere of orange fire and twisted metal. General Valdrax was vaporized before his brain could even process the failure of his invincible shield. On Kepler Station, Commander Valia stood in the observation deck watching the battle unfold on the long-range monitors. She gasped, her hands flying to the glass. Around her, the Velinar refugees fell dead silent. They had spent 3 generations running from the Corax. They had watched those crimson ships burn their cities, slaughter their armies, and hunt their children. They had believed the Corax were gods of war. But in less than 40 seconds, the human fleet had eviscerated the vanguard. The railguns fired again. The void lit up with the silent, invisible streaks of kinetic death. 3 more Corax cruisers were gutted. Their shields flared and died. Their hulls cracked open like dry bone. The remaining 16 Corax ships, gripped by a sudden, absolute panic, broke formation. They fired their thrusters, turning their massive drives away from Earth, fleeing back toward the dark edge of the solar system. Valia turned slowly away from the window. She looked at the human security guards standing by the blast doors. They were quiet. They were professional. They did not cheer. They simply watched the monitors, their hands resting on their rifles. She realized then the terrifying truth about the species that had granted her asylum. They were not naive builders. They were not peaceful because they lacked the capacity for violence. They were peaceful because they had mastered violence so completely that they understood its terrible cost. They were apex predators who had chosen against all the instincts of the dark forest of the galaxy to become guardians. Down in Cheyenne Mountain, there was no celebration. Admiral Sterling Vance stood with his hands locked behind his back. The command floor was quiet save for the rhythmic pinging of the orbital radar. The Vanguard had been shattered. It was a flawless tactical victory. Not a single human life had been lost. But Vance felt the cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. It was too easy, he murmured, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the servers. Sir, the radar operator asked. Valdrax was a fool, Vance said, his eyes scanning the telemetry data. He came in arrogant. He didn't use electronic countermeasures. He didn't screen his advance with fighters. That wasn't an invasion force. That was a scouting party. The radar operator looked back at his screen. He frowned. He tapped the glass. Admiral, I am reading a gravitational anomaly. Just past the asteroid belt. How big? Vance asked. The operator swallowed hard. The color drained from his face. Sir, the system is struggling to calculate the mass. It's distorting the local gravity well. The main tactical screen flickered. The green icons of the retreating Corax Vanguard vanished. In their place, the screen began to fill with red. First a dozen, then 50, then 100. The red icons cascaded down the display like a waterfall of blood. The tactical computer chimed a steady rhythmic tolling of a funeral bell. 200 contacts, the operator whispered. Dreadnought class, heavy carriers, escort frigates. Sir, they're dropping out of hyperspace all at once. The energy spike is blinding our deep space arrays. Vance stared at the screen. This was not a punitive expedition. This was an extermination fleet. The supreme commander of the Corax Empire, Zarkos, had arrived. Unlike Valdrax, Zarkos did not broadcast a threat. He did not ask for surrender. He did not care about the pride of a monologue. Zarkos was an artist of annihilation, and he had come to paint the solar system in ash. The moment his massive flagship, the Oblivion, translated into real space, Zarkos gave a single order. Jam them. On Earth, every civilian television screen, every radio broadcast, every cellular network dissolved into deafening static. The global communications grid staggered. In Cheyenne Mountain, half the tactical monitors went black. The encrypted military channels shrieked with interference. Sir, we are losing orbital telemetry. The communications officer shouted over the noise. They are flooding the spectrum with white noise. I can't reach the fleet. Vance stepped up to the primary console. He did not panic. Panic was a luxury a commander could not afford. Switch to tight beam optical lasers, Vance ordered. Line of sight only. Relay the signal from the moon base to the fleet. Tell them to hold the line at the Kepler perimeter. Nothing gets past them. In the dark space surrounding Kepler Station, the human fleet of 97 ships tightened their formation. They formed a sphere of interlocking fields of fire around the habitat. They were outnumbered 2-to-1 by ships 3 times their size. The Corax Armada moved like a thunderhead. They did not charge blindly. Zarkos deployed thousands of unmanned fighter drones, a swarm of mechanical locusts designed to overwhelm the human targeting computers. Behind the drone swarm, the massive dreadnoughts began their creeping advance, their thermal lances charging. And then the Corax changed the rules of engagement. Zarkos knew the station was the objective. He knew the human fleet would not fire heavy railguns at the station for fear of destroying it. Launch the breaching pods, Zarkos commanded from the bridge of the Oblivion. Take the habitat from the inside. Slaughter the refugees. Let the humans watch their failure. From the underbellies of the Corax carriers, hundreds of black armored spikes shot out into the void. They were boarding torpedoes propelled by chemical rockets, accelerating toward Kepler Station at terrifying speed. On the bridge of the USS Liberty, Captain Miller saw the pods on his optical sensors. Point Defense tracked those pods. The human fleet opened up with a storm of rotary cannons and flak batteries. The space around the station exploded with shrapnel. Dozens of the boarding pods were shredded into scrap metal before they even reached the habitat. But there were too many. Inside Kepler Station, the alarm shifted from a steady warning pulse to a frantic screaming wail. The lighting shifted to a deep blood-red emergency hue. Thaddeus Boone was in the lower agricultural sector trying to manually lock down the atmospheric bulkheads when the first pod hit. The impact shook the massive station so violently that Boone was thrown off his feet. The metal deck screamed as the Corax breaching pod pierced the outer hull. The pressurized air in the corridor immediately began to vent, howling like a dying animal until the automated blast doors slammed shut, sealing the breach. Boone pushed himself up off the deck. He tasted blood in his mouth. He looked down the long, red-lit corridor. The blast doors at the far end were hissing. The metal was glowing white-hot in a perfect circle. They were cutting through. "Chief Boone," a voice yelled. Boone turned. Down the opposite end of the hall, a squad of 6 United States Space Marines was sprinting toward him in heavy combat armor. Their rifles were raised. Behind them, running with a desperate, clumsy gait, was Reiner, one of the Velinar engineers Boone had been working with. "Get behind us, Chief," the Marine squad leader barked, taking up a firing position behind a steel cargo crate. Boone didn't run. He walked over to an emergency weapons locker bolted to the wall. He punched the glass out with his heavy gloved fist, ignoring the lacerations. He pulled out a 12-gauge trench shotgun designed for close-quarters riot control in the tight confines of a spaceship. He pumped the action. The heavy clack-clack echoed in the corridor. "I built this station," Boone growled, taking a position next to the Marines. "I ain't letting some alien trash tear up my drywall." The glowing circle on the blast door blew inward with a deafening concussion. Smoke poured into the corridor. Through the haze, massive figures emerged. The Korak shock troops stood 7 feet tall, clad in thick, interlocking armor plating. They carried heavy plasma repeaters. They moved with terrifying speed, expecting to find unarmed refugees cowering in the dark. They found the United States Marines. "Open fire," the squad leader roared. The corridor erupted. The sound was deafening, trapped within the steel walls. The Marines fired armor-piercing rounds in disciplined 3-round bursts. The kinetic impact staggered the massive Korax warriors. Their armor sparked and cratered under the ballistic assault. The Korax returned fire. Blue plasma bolts scorched the air, melting the steel crates the humans were using for cover. A Marine to Boone's left took a glancing hit to the shoulder. The plasma burned through his armor instantly, the smell of cooked flesh filling the corridor. The Marine went down screaming. Boone stepped out from cover. He didn't aim. He just pointed the heavy shotgun at the closest Korax warrior and pulled the trigger. At a range of 20 feet, the blast of double-aught buckshot hit the Korax in the chest with the force of a battering ram. The kinetic shock bypassed the alien's armor plating, shattering its ribs and throwing the massive creature backward onto the deck. Boone pumped the shotgun. "Welcome to Earth, you ugly son of a bitch." He fired again. Beside him, Reiner, the Velinar engineer, picked up the fallen Marine's rifle. Reiner had never held a weapon in his life. His hands shook. But he looked at Boone, he looked at the wounded Marine on the floor, and he raised the rifle. He pulled the trigger, joining his fire with the humans. All across Kepler Station, in the hydroponics bays, in the residential corridors, in the engineering sublevels, the scene repeated itself. It was a brutal, bloody knife fight in the dark. The Korax had superior technology and physical strength. But the humans had the terrain, the heavy shotguns, and a fierce, uncompromising refusal to yield a single inch of ground. And they were not fighting alone. The Velinar, inspired by the people who had offered them a home, picked up whatever they could find, wrenches, pipes, dropped rifles, and fought beside their protectors. Outside the station, the void was burning. The drone swarm had closed the distance. The human fleet was engulfed in a cloud of mechanical gnats. The drones did not pack heavy weapons, but they clamped onto the hulls of the human ships, using microcutters to target communication arrays, sensor nodes, and point defense turrets. With the human fleet distracted by the swarm, Zarkos moved his dreadnoughts into firing range. "Target the orbital habitat," Zarkos ordered. "Break their sanctuary. Break their spirit." 6 Korax dreadnoughts aligned in their primary spinal batteries directly at Kepler Station. These were not the thermal lances of the Vanguard. These were heavy singularity cannons designed to crack planetary crusts. In Cheyenne Mountain, the telemetry managed to punch through the jamming for exactly 3 seconds. It was enough. Admiral Vance saw the energy spikes building on the Korax dreadnoughts. He saw their trajectory. He looked at the shield status of Kepler Station. It was holding at 12%. The singularity cannons would punch through the shields and gut the station, instantly killing the 40,000 Velinar refugees and the thousands of human personnel aboard. Vance looked at the tactical map. He looked at the position of the fleet. There was no time to maneuver the destroyers. There was no time to evacuate. There was only one asset massive enough and close enough to intercept the incoming fire. The USS Aegis, a supercarrier, Admiral Vance's own flagship, currently holding position in the center of the defensive formation. Vance reached out. He pressed the heavy brass-rimmed button on his console that opened an unfiltered, fleet-wide channel. His hand was perfectly steady. "This is Admiral Vance to the USS Aegis," he said. Aboard the massive carrier, the bridge crew heard his voice. The captain of the Aegis, a stoic veteran named Harris, gripped his command console. "We read you, Admiral. Captain Harris. The enemy dreadnoughts are targeting the station. The shields will not hold." Harris looked at his tactical display. He saw the firing solutions. He knew instantly what the Admiral was going to ask. He knew what it meant. Aboard the Aegis were 3,000 American sailors, 3,000 sons and daughters, fathers and mothers. Harris did not hesitate. "What are your orders?" Admiral Vance closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The weight of the stars pressed down on his shoulders. The cost of leadership. The terrible price of holding the line. "Break formation, Captain. Put your ship between those dreadnoughts and Kepler Station. Full spread on your deflector arrays. Brace for impact." There was a pause on the line. It lasted only a second, but in that second, the entire history of human courage seemed to echo in the silence. "Understood, Admiral," Captain Harris said calmly. Vance kept the channel open. He wanted the entire fleet to hear. He wanted the Corax to hear. He wanted history to record the exact moment humanity decided who they were. "Listen to me," Vance said, his voice echoing across the bridge of every human ship in the solar system. His tone was low gravelly, completely devoid of theatricality. It was the voice of a man making a blood oath in the dark. "We knew this day would come. We knew the price of opening our doors. Some of us are not going to make it home today. I will not lie to you. The odds are not in our favor. The enemy is older, they are stronger, and they believe they have the right to take whatever they want." Vance looked at the silent faces of the men and women in Cheyenne Mountain. Tears were streaking down the faces of some of the operators, but their hands never left their consoles. But the people on that station, the people huddled in the dark right now, they deserve a chance. They came to us for shelter. They came to us because they believed there was still light in this galaxy. Vance's voice hardened into steel. "Protecting the weak, standing in the breach when no one else will, that is what makes us human. That is our identity. We do not break. We do not yield. And I promise you this, no Corax ship will pass this line while a single human heart still beats. Hold the line." On the bridge of the USS Aegis, Captain Harris turned to his helmsman. "All ahead flank. Take us into the fire." The massive supercarrier engines burned with blinding intensity. The massive gray ship broke from the defensive sphere, accelerating with agonizing slowness. It drove itself directly into the path of the 6 Corax dreadnoughts. It was a magnificent, terrifying sight. A single ship of iron and steel stepping in front of a firing squad to protect a house made of glass. Aboard Kepler Station, Commander Valia watched through the viewport as the massive bulk of the Aegis eclipsed the stars, placing itself directly over the habitat's central agricultural ring. She pressed her hand to the glass. She could not breathe. She was watching 3,000 humans intentionally drive into the jaws of death simply because they had promised to keep her safe. On the Corax flagship, Supreme Commander Zarkos watched the maneuver with cold, alien confusion. "It makes no sense," Zarkos muttered. "They are sacrificing their capital ship to save refugees. It defies logic. It is tactical suicide." He raised his hand. "Erase them." The 6 Corax dreadnoughts fired simultaneously. 6 beams of concentrated, annihilating energy tore across the void. They struck the hull of the USS Aegis. The supercarrier's deflector arrays flared brilliantly, screaming as they tried to disperse the apocalyptic heat. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, the shields held. The sky above Kepler Station was painted in blinding, violent purple light. Then the deflectors overloaded. The singularity beams punched through the thick titanium armor of the Aegis. The hull began to melt. Decks collapsed. Atmosphere vented in explosive jets of freezing vapor. On the bridge of the Aegis, alarm screamed. The deck was tilted at a 30-degree angle. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks. Captain Harris held onto the command rail, blood pouring down the side of his face. His crew was dead or dying around him. The ship was breaking apart in his hands. "Status," he coughed, tasting ash. A young ensign, missing an arm, dragged himself to a surviving console. "Engineering is gone, sir. Reactor containment failing. We are dead in the water." Harris looked at the tactical screen. The Aegis was ruined. It was a burning, shattered wreck. But it was still in the way. It had absorbed the blast. Kepler Station was untouched. We held, Harris whispered. His vision began to fade. We held the line. The reactor of the USS Aegis breached. The ship detonated a massive silent explosion that rocked the entire human defensive formation. The shockwave rattled the windows of Kepler Station, a physical testament to the sacrifice of 3,000 souls. Admiral Vance watched the icon of his flagship vanish from the screen. He did not blink. He did not look away. He absorbed the blow, filing the grief away in a dark, heavy vault in his mind. There would be time to mourn later, if there was a later. In the brief silence following the destruction of the Aegis, a new alert chimed on the operator's console in Cheyenne Mountain. "Sir," the radar operator said, his voice trembling, not with fear but with absolute disbelief. "I am reading new hyperspace signatures. Massive distortions. Behind the Corax fleet. Zarkos's reinforcements." Vance asked, his voice flat. "No, sir. The energy signatures. They aren't Corax." Above the burning wreckage of the USS Aegis, the fabric of space tore open again. Not in one place, but in 50. 50 hyperspace portals bloomed in the dark. From the rifts, ships began to emerge. They were not human ships. They were not Corax ships. They were sleek silver cruisers of the Talonari. They were heavy, blocky destroyers of the Fenti. They were ships belonging to a dozen different species across the galaxy. Species that had been conquered. Species that had been cowed. Species that had paid tribute to the Corax Empire for centuries out of absolute paralyzing fear. But they had watched the human fleet. They had watched a young primitive species stand up to the monsters in the dark. They had watched a human supercarrier burn itself to ash to protect strangers. And they had found their courage. On the bridge of the Oblivion, Zarkos stared at the new arrivals in absolute shock. His tactical officers were screaming. They were flanked. They were surrounded by the very species they had enslaved. A new transmission punched through the Corax jamming broadcast on an open universal frequency. It was the voice of the Talonari ambassador. An old, weary voice that now rang with newfound iron. "General Zarkos," the voice echoed across the void. "You have burned our worlds. You have taken our children. But today you face the United Alliance of Free Worlds. And today you burn." Admiral Vance looked at the screen. He allowed himself a single grim smile. "All ships," Vance ordered. "Push them back into the dark." The real war had just begun. Space became a slaughterhouse. For 1,000 years, the Corax Empire had dictated the terms of survival in the galaxy. They fought with overwhelming numbers. They fought with absolute technological superiority. They fought with the arrogant certainty that no prey would ever turn around and bite the wolf. Today the wolf was bleeding. Supreme Commander Zarkos stood on the bridge of the Oblivion, surrounded by the screaming alarms of his own dying fleet. The 50 hyperspace portals that had opened behind his armada were not anomalies. They were an execution block. The Talonari, the Fenti, the Morath, species that Zarkos had personally subjected to orbital bombardment. Species that had surrendered their dignity for a few more years of miserable survival. They were not surrendering today. "Fire!" Zarkos roared, his crimson scales flushed black with fury. "Turn the broadside batteries, burn the traitors." But the Corax fleet was already engaged with the humans. Their defensive formations were locked forward, targeting the gray, jagged ships of the United States Space Command. To turn their heavy weapons rearward meant exposing their vulnerable engine blocks to the human railguns. It was a tactical nightmare. It was the anvil and the hammer. In Cheyenne Mountain, Admiral Sterling Vance watched the tactical board shift. The green icons of the newly arrived Alliance fleet slammed into the red icons of the Corax rear guard. The Talonari cruisers fired concentrated particle beams. The Fenti destroyers launched swarms of antimatter torpedoes. It was a chaotic, uncoordinated assault born of generations of suppressed rage. The Alliance ships did not have the discipline of the human fleet, but they had the numbers, and they had the anger. Vance leaned over the command console. The time for holding the line was over. The time for breaking the enemy had come. "All human vessels," Vance ordered. His voice was cold iron. "Advance, push them into the fire." The battered, scorched remnants of the human fleet responded. Captain Miller on the USS Liberty wiped the blood from his eyes. His destroyer was missing a third of its port armor. Fires raged in the lower decks. But the main drive was still hot. and the magnetic coils of the railgun were still humming. All ahead, Full Miller growled around his ruined cigar. Ramming speed if you have to. Do not let them breathe. The human fleet surged forward. It was a brutal kinetic brawl, short, vicious engagement as at point-blank range in the vacuum of space. A Corax heavy cruiser tried to pivot away from a Talinari particle beam, only to drift directly into the firing arc of a United States frigate. The frigate did not hesitate. It fired a tungsten slug straight through the Corax bridge. The massive crimson ship drifted lifelessly, venting atmosphere and frozen bodies into the void. Tubes 1 through 4. Fire. Impact. Target the engines. Fire. Hull breach confirmed. The comms chatter in Cheyenne Mountain was a staccato rhythm of clinical professional violence. There was no cheering. There was only the grim, methodical dismantling of an empire. Inside Kepler Station, the war was measured in inches. The corridors of the orbital habitat were choked with thick, acrid smoke. Emergency sprinklers sprayed a fine mist over the scorched metal decks. The smell was horrific. Melted plastic, vaporized steel, cooked blood. Thaddeus Boone knelt behind an overturned hydroponics tank. His breathing was ragged. His heavy canvas jacket was soaked with sweat and something darker. A Corax plasma bolt had grazed his left side, cauterizing the flesh just above his hip. The pain was a dull, throbbing roar in his ears. Down the corridor, the surviving Corax shock troops were dug in behind a barricade of torn deck plating. There were 4 of them left. They were trapped. Their boarding pods had been destroyed by the human fleet outside. Their fleet was dying. They had nowhere to go, which made them incredibly dangerous. They were firing blindly into the smoke, trying to keep the humans pinned down. Boone checked the breech of his trench shotgun. 2 shells left. Beside him, Reiner, the Velinar engineer, was trembling. He clutched a dead Marine's assault rifle. His face was gray with terror, but he had not run. He had stayed beside the man who had built his home. Chief Reiner whispered, his voice shaking. They are going to push. They are preparing their heavy repeaters. Boone looked at the 3 surviving Marines on the other side of the corridor. They were out of grenades. Their armor was cracked and blackened. They push, we die, Boone grunted. He forced himself to his feet. His wounded side screamed in protest. We don't wait. We hit them first. Boone looked at the Velinar engineer. Stay here, kid. You've done enough. Reiner shook his head. He gripped the rifle tighter. We protect each other. That is what you taught us. Boone looked at the alien for a long second. Then he nodded. Okay, on 3. Boone racked the shotgun. The heavy clack echoed through the smoke. 1. He tightened his grip on the grip. 2. He took a deep breath of the burning air. 3. Boone stepped out from cover. He did not run. He walked forward, a massive bleeding titan of human stubbornness. He raised the shotgun to his shoulder. He fired. The double-aught buckshot shattered the optical sensors of the Corax barricade. The Marines surged forward from the opposite side, firing their rifles from the hip, laying down a wall of suppressing fire. Reiner stepped out beside Boone, pulling the trigger of the assault rifle, screaming a battle cry in a language the station had never heard. The Corax warriors rose to return fire. Boone pumped the shotgun. He fired his last shell. It caught the lead Corax in the throat, bypassing the heavy chest plates. The alien warrior gargled dark blood and collapsed backward. The Marines closed the distance. It devolved into a savage, brutal melee. Rifle butts against armored helmets. Combat knives slipping into the joints of alien armor. Boone swung his empty shotgun like a baseball bat, crushing the knee of a Corax warrior, trying to aim a plasma pistol at Reiner. It lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, the corridor was silent, save for the hiss of the fire suppressors. The Corax were dead. Boone dropped his ruined shotgun. He leaned against the bulkhead, sliding down to the wet deck. He pressed a heavy hand against his bleeding side. Reiner dropped to his knees beside the engineer. Chief, you are bleeding. We need a medic. Boone looked up at the ceiling of the corridor. The red emergency lights were still spinning, but the sound of the hull breaching alarms had stopped. I'm fine, Kid, Boone wheezed, closing his eyes. Just need a minute, and a damn cup of coffee. Outside the station, the Corax Armada was breaking. Supreme Commander Zarkos stood in the ruins of his bridge. The Oblivion was venting plasma from 3 separate hull breaches. The main deflector arrays were gone. His tactical screen was a graveyard. 100 Corax ships were dead in the water. 50 more were retreating into the deep black, abandoning formation, abandoning their commander, abandoning their pride. The human fleet supported by the Alliance cruisers was tightening the noose. Zarkos looked at the gray blocky ships of the United States. He looked at the sleek silver vessels of the slaves he had oppressed. He realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that he had fundamentally misunderstood the universe. He had believed that power was derived from fear. He had believed that the strong survived by crushing the weak. But humanity had proven a different, infinitely more dangerous truth. Power derived from the willingness to bleed for the man standing next to you. The humans had not fought out of fear of the Corax. They had fought out of a sacred, unbreakable obligation to protect the people behind them. You cannot break a shield that does not care if it shatters. Warning the Oblivion's automated computer chimed. Multiple kinetic locks detected. Main reactor instability at critical. Zarkos closed his eyes. Helm, he whispered. The word tasted like ash. Commander, initiate emergency hyperspace jump. Any vector. Get us out of here. The Corax did not retreat. It was beaten into their culture from birth. To retreat was to forfeit their right to exist in the Empire. But Zarkos was not retreating from a battle. He was running from a reckoning. The Oblivion's massive sublight engines flared a blinding, desperate blue. The massive dreadnought tore a hole in space-time, ripping itself out of the solar system, leaving behind a trail of burning debris and the shattered myth of Corax invincibility. The remaining Corax ships that still had functional engines followed their commander. They jumped blindly into the dark, scattering like cockroaches fleeing a light. And then there was silence. The battle was over. In the subterranean bunker of Cheyenne Mountain, nobody cheered. There was no applause. There was no backslapping. The operators sat at their consoles, staring at the telemetry screens, their faces pale, illuminated by the cold green light of the radar. The space surrounding Kepler Station was a massive, silent graveyard. The debris field stretched for thousands of miles. Twisted metal, frozen coolant, the shattered hulls of Corax dreadnoughts floating alongside the broken spines of United States destroyers. Admiral Sterling Vance stood at the center of the room. He took off his headset. He placed it carefully on the edge of the tactical table. The silence in the room was heavier than the noise of the battle. Status of the orbital habitat, Vance said. His voice was a rasp. The radar operator swallowed hard. Shield generators are offline, sir. Hull integrity at 60%. But life support is stable. The station holds. Vance nodded slowly. And the fleet, the communications officer stood up. She held a data pad. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to brace it against her hip. Sir, the Corax Vanguard is destroyed. The main fleet has retreated. The Alliance vessels are holding position and offering medical assistance. I asked about our fleet, Lieutenant Vance said quietly. The lieutenant looked down at the pad. A tear escaped her eye, tracing a clean line through the sweat on her cheek. We lost 23 ships, Admiral. Completely destroyed. 15 more are critically damaged. They will have to be scuttled. Vance felt the air leave his lungs. He did not let it show on his face. The men and women in this room needed a commander, not a mourner. Not yet. Casualties, Vance asked. We are still running the tallies, sir. The lieutenant's voice broke. With the loss of the Aegis and the destroyers, we are looking at over 7,000 dead, maybe more. 7,000. 7,000 American sailors. Young men and women who had left Earth to patrol the quiet dark, who had found themselves standing in the fires of an alien war. They had burned so that strangers might live. Begin search and rescue operations, Vance said. His voice was incredibly soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. I want every single escape pod tracked. I want every piece of wreckage scanned. We leave no one in the dark. Bring our people home. Yes, sir. Vance turned away from the main screen. He walked toward his small, glass-walled office at the edge of the command floor. He walked with his spine straight, his shoulders square. He closed the door behind him. He closed the blinds. Only then, in the absolute privacy of the dark, did Admiral Sterling Vance place his hands on his desk, bow his head, and weep. He wept for Captain Harris. He wept for the crew of the Aegis. He wept for the terrible, crushing weight of the stars. Aboard Kepler Station, Commander Valia stood in the observation deck. The glass of the viewport was cracked in a dozen places, spider-webbed from the kinetic shockwaves of the battle. Through the fractured glass, she looked out at the debris field. She saw the massive blackened wreckage of the USS Aegis floating silently against the backdrop of Earth. She knew what that ship had done. She had watched it drive itself into the path of the singularity beams. She had watched it take the blow meant for her people. Behind her, the doors to the observation deck hissed open. Dr. Eris Thorne walked in. He wore a hazard suit covered in the blood of Korax warriors and human marines. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "Are your people safe?" Commander Thorne asked, stopping beside her. Valia did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the floating wreckage of the human supercarrier. "We are safe," she whispered. The Korax boarding parties were neutralized. "The station holds." Thorne nodded. He leaned heavily against the railing. "Good." Valia finally turned to look at the human doctor. Her dark eyes were brimming with tears. She fell to her knees. She bowed her head, pressing her forehead against the cold metal deck of the station. It was the deepest gesture of submission and reverence her culture possessed. Dr. Thorne stepped back uncomfortable. "Commander, please. Get up. I do not understand," Valia sobbed, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I do not understand you. You did not know us. We offered you nothing. We brought the wrath of the Empire to your world. Why? Why would you pay such a price for us?" Thorne looked down at the alien commander. He looked out the window at the broken ships of his own people. "Because we said we would," Thorne answered simply. He reached down and offered her his hand. Valia looked at the hand. It was bruised. It was stained with blood. It was the hand of a species that had mastered the terrible art of war, but had chosen to use it as a shield. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet. "You asked us for shelter," Thorne said, his voice quiet but firm. "You asked us for a home. We don't take promises lightly, Commander. The price was high, but if we had stood by and watched you burn, the price would have been our souls. We wouldn't be human anymore." Valia looked back out at the stars. The solar system was scarred. The orbital lanes were choked with wreckage. But the Earth still spun below them, blue and green and perfectly serene. "We will remember this," Valia said, her voice tightening with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. "My people will sing of this day until the stars burn out. We will build monuments to your dead. We will teach our children the names of your ships. We will never forget what humanity did for us." Thorne managed a tired, incredibly sad smile. "Just help us clean up the yard, Commander. That'll be enough." In the weeks that followed, the galaxy fundamentally changed. The Korax Empire did not collapse overnight. An empire built on 1,000 years of terror does not vanish with a single defeat. But the myth of their invincibility was broken. The footage of the Battle of Kepler Station spread across the hyperspace communication networks. It was smuggled onto enslaved worlds. It was broadcast on pirate frequencies. Every species in the dark forest of the galaxy watched the gray, blocky ships of the United States Space Command tear the invincible Korax vanguard to pieces. They watched the USS Aegis take a killing blow to protect a station full of refugees. They watched the Alliance fleet arrive to push the monsters back into the dark. For the first time in a millennia, the galaxy felt something other than fear. They felt hope. Rebellion sparked on a dozen Korax colony worlds. The Talinari and the Fenty formalized their military alliance, pooling their resources to build ships modeled after human kinetic destroyers. They began to fight back, not as scattered insurgents, but as an organized, unified front. And at the center of this new fragile coalition was Earth. Humanity did not ask to lead the galaxy. They did not want an empire. They were builders. They were explorers. They were deeply flawed, fractured, and fiercely independent people who just wanted to be left alone to chart the stars. But the universe had knocked on their door, and they had answered. Kepler Station was repaired. The scorch marks were polished out of the corridors. The shattered glass of the observation deck was replaced. The Velinar refugees stepped out of survival mode and began to truly live. They worked alongside human engineers in the orbital shipyards. They shared their advanced knowledge of energy manipulation, helping human scientists develop faster, cleaner, sublight drives. They became the first alien citizens of the solar system. A monument was built in the central agricultural ring of the station. It was a massive slab of black granite quarried from the mountains of Earth and hauled up into orbit. Carved into the stone were the names of the 7,412 American sailors and Marines who had died defending the station. At the bottom of the monument, etched in both English and Velinar, was a single sentence. We held the line. A year after the battle, Admiral Sterling Vance retired from active duty. He walked out of Cheyenne Mountain for the last time, stepping into the bright, blinding sunlight of a Colorado morning. He was an old man. He had carried the weight of the world, and he had set it down. He drove up into the mountains to a small cabin overlooking a quiet valley. He sat on the porch holding a cup of black coffee and looked up at the daytime sky. He knew the war was not over. The Corax would rebuild. Other threats would emerge from the dark. The universe was vast, and it was full of monsters. But Vance also knew that humanity had found its purpose. They were not the conquerors. They were not the enlightened diplomats. They were the rough men and women standing on the wall in the middle of the night. They were the guardians at the gate. The galaxy had learned a profound, terrifying, and beautiful lesson. You can threaten the strong. You can oppress the weak. You can burn worlds and enslave empires. But if you back the innocent into a corner, if you push the helpless to the brink of annihilation, if you force them to send a desperate plea into the cold, dark void, you must be prepared for what answers. Because when the weak cry out for salvation, when the innocent ask for a shield against the dark, humans will come, always.